Hello everyone and welcome to our very first lecture in AP World History Modern. Today we're going to look at developments in East Asia, mainly focusing on Song China. So to kind of set the stage for you guys, if we were looking previously in Chinese history, we're seeing that probably about 1,000 years previous to the start of this course, the Han Dynasty in China falls. And over the next 400 years or so, you see 30 different dynasties rise and fall and have various amounts of success and failures, mainly failures. But ultimately what happens is in 589, Emperor Wendi is able to unite northern and southern China. And from this period on, you're going to see golden age in China over the next two dynasties that are going to take place. The Tang Dynasty, which is established with Emperor Wendi, and then the Song Dynasty, which is what we're considering, or the main topic here in this lecture. Now, ultimately, what will happen is the Tang Dynasty will collapse due to internal and external pressures and lead to another warring states period, like you saw that the 400 years after the fall of the Han Dynasty. And ultimately, what will happen is this will actually open the door for the Song Dynasty to take hold eventually, but China will become geographically isolated because of this, at least for a period. All right, so kind of just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about and kind of the beginnings of the Song Dynasty. So the Song Dynasty started in 960 when Taizu was able to reunite northern and southern China and start that dynasty. And from there, the Song China is able to establish a very powerful, stable empire for at least 150, 160 years. But ultimately what ends up happening is the Jin, or the Liao, from northern China or Manchuria, come in and invade the Song Dynasty's territory and defeat them. And eventually what ends up happening to the Song Dynasty is they lose the northern half of the empire and are pushed to the southern part of modern-day China. Their capital is in Hangzhou, which is right here, which is very important because from an economic standpoint, especially when the Song lose the northern half of the empire, with the power base being on the sea, the trade system, economic system for China is actually going to shift from the Silk Road's mainland, over the mainland, to more of an East Asian sea trading base. So the Song Dynasty overall, they're going to fail militarily, but they're really going to flourish economically, and that is going to be because of ultimately what they lose in connections overland to the Silk Roads. They have to find another way to trade, and they do that by sea. All right, so kind of give you a brief overview of the social structure within the empire. It was a patriarchal society, really because the men were held in higher regards over women, and this was a reflection of the Confucian principles that were developed centuries before and in part of the way of life of China. Now, filial piety is a very important principle that you guys need to know from a social standpoint for the Song Dynasty, because it taught subordination and respect to elders and superiors, especially males. And this is important, and you're going to see this a couple of times throughout the slides in this lecture, that ideal of filial piety and that you respecting your elders or your superiors is really going to be supported by the emperor or the emperors of China, because it gives them support. It's a philosophical position within the empire or within the society that actually gives imperial support. And you can see that this principle was heavily based on and focused on in the schooling. Examples there, the book Classics of Filial Piety were something that you had to learn if you were going to go to school. And then there were a certain number of groups of people, such as merchants or artists, that were viewed through Confucian ideals that they were people without meaning in life due to the jobs they performed. All right, now the role of women. Women were subservient to men, and this was something that had persisted in China previously. And under the Tang and Song dynasties, this actually even further, the role of women further declined throughout those societies. Now, so much so that you had women actually binding their feet in the upper class, as you can see there on the screen. They would bind their feet at a very young age, and then slowly kind of give them smaller and smaller shoes to the point where it actually deform and cripple many of these women for life. And you can see just how painful that might be just looking at that picture there on the screen. Now, one woman, Ban Zhao, she was a very influential, educated woman during this period. She actually advocated for women to be educated, but not for necessarily for their freedom and advancement, but more so that they could fit within the society and better serve their husbands, better serve the men in their life, and to raise more virtuous sons, to kind of proliferate and kind of strengthen their family from that standpoint. Now, lastly here, women that were peasants, they actually faced the most equality within Chinese life during this time, because peasants just had to work to survive. There wasn't really necessarily a huge difference between peasant men and women, because they were just trying to live their lives and survive. All right, so some changes in society itself. So over the course of the Song Dynasty, you see that society actually becomes more mobile, both in terms of where they actually are able to go, because you see people moving to cities, but also between classes and moving up between lower to middle to upper class in some cases. Now, not huge numbers here. We're not talking about like, oh, if you're all lower class, you really have an equal opportunity to get into the wealthy classes, but there is more mobility than what you were seeing previously. Part of that is you see a development of a scholar official class within the wealthy class, or gentry. This is really based on the fact that they use the civil service exam, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. You do see some more defined classes in terms of within the middle class, with merchants, artisans, where they're earning more money and becoming more powerful, but still maintaining a middle class status. And then you have your lower classes, which are your typical laborers, servants, as well as your soldiers as well. But there is a lot more mobility here. All right, politically, within Song China, you see a strong centralized bureaucracy, a strong system of government. And this is really kind of just what they've taken on from the previous dynasties that existed in China before them, whether it's the Qin, the Han, or the Tang. They kind of just keep that going because it works. And China's a really, really big country, an area to control, so they need a strong centralized government. Now, from a political standpoint, the mandate of heaven, which is something that was, if you took some other world history courses and studied China previously, the mandate of heaven would have come up, is basically it defines the emperor's legitimacy of rule, and linking the ruler to, hey, look, the heavens are giving him the mandate to rule over the people, therefore he has the right to rule. Now, I did mention previously the civil service exam, or the merit-based system. The Song were really heavily built on using this system. So you actually had the ability, based on merit, based on your skill, that you could actually move up through the ranks in government within this society. Now, in theory, it was meant that everybody could advance, no matter what class you were in. But really, in practice, it was only really left up to the nobility or wealthy classes or higher upper middle class, just for the fact that they had to be able to pay for the education and the ability to prepare for these exams. So, yes, everybody could move up, but you had to have the money to actually pay for the schooling. And then what ends up happening is the Song, they really valued loyalty. And if you were very skilled and very loyal, then you would be paid handsomely. And what this actually did over time is it was a huge benefit, because if you were really skilled and loyal, then you're getting more money. So you're giving, great things to people that are skilled, but it puts more emphasis on this system. And over time, people eventually take advantage of that, and that's going to cause some problems down the line. Now, Confucianism, as I stated previously, was really highly accepted by the government because it was required or kind of pushed praising or obedience for superiors, and the emperors enjoyed that. All right, so religion/philosophy. So there are a lot of different religions or philosophical ideologies that were very successful in China before this time and during the Song Dynasty. Mainly you had Buddhism, Taoism, legalism, and Confucianism. Confucianism is more a philosophical ideology rather than religion. But you see it. It's something that's been in Chinese society for many centuries up to the point of the Song Dynasty. It's well respected. It's practiced by most everybody in place. And eventually, what actually ends up happening with the mixtures of these different ideologies and religions is that Confucianism, a lot of these people that solely followed it actually start to feel threatened under the Song Dynasty, threatened by Buddhism during the Song Dynasty, and they start to actually push back against Buddhists. For example, you have Confucian scholars that are saying the Buddhist monasteries and monks are trying to threaten the imperial rule when in reality they weren't. So that kind of puts Buddhism on a little bit of a back burner. And then as well as you have, with this kind of pushing against the Buddhists, the Confucians, or people that follow Confucianism, you actually see that art-wise, Confucian artists and literary people actually push the Buddhists back as well. So you see kind of a stunting of the growth of Buddhism at the expense of Confucianism moving forward within the Song Dynasty. Now, that doesn't mean that Buddhism is going to completely fail or fall apart in China. It actually succeeds greatly during the Song Dynasty. It just has some pushback by the old Confucian ideals. Buddhism was actually introduced into China during around 900. Actually, a little bit before that, but gains really successful importance around 900. So just before the Song Dynasty really comes into play. So really, we're kind of talking about when the Confucian ideals are really pushing back, or Confucianists are really pushing back against Buddhists in China. It's in the early days of the Song Dynasty. Now, Buddhism was accepted by many in China because it fit easily alongside other religions or philosophies, such as Confucianism. So really, a lot of people, what they did is they said, okay, I can practice this religion, but it really fits nicely and doesn't change anything within the ideals of Confucianism. And that's important because remember, Confucianism is really a philosophical ideology, not a religion in itself, so they can mix fairly well. So what this does is, since like we talked about previously, Confucian bureaucrats were trying to convince the emperor or the imperial court that Buddhists were trying to threaten that rule. What that ultimately ends up doing is, for a time, there are millions of Buddhists in China already, and they actually start to practice Buddhism more privately because it's more of an individualized religion, as you guys will see, or if you look back on the other religions such as Hinduism or the other monotheistic religions that are mainly across the world, they start to practice that more privately and then just are more public with their Confucian ideals. And that actually works. Again, it fits in with that second bullet point there, that they kind of can work together. There are three main branches of Buddhism you need to know. There's Theravada, Mahayana, and Tibetan Buddhism. And you guys can see them here on the screen here. Theravada Buddhism is the oldest tradition within the Buddhist principles, Buddhist religion, and it's viewed as the best way to attain enlightenment. And they focus on, hey, this is how you can do this. Mainly it's through actually living the religion as a monk or a nun, at least in terms of a profession. In other ways to obtain nirvana is through meditation. And this still exists in all the other ones as well. And the idea is that you need to find one path, or there's only one path to enlightenment, and that focuses it on the individual religion. What I was talking about earlier with why a lot of Buddhists would practice privately their Buddhist ideals and then publicly do their Confucianist ideals is because this form of Buddhism is individual. Now, Mahayana is people can actually help. The idea in this one is that people can actually help others reach enlightenment, whereas in Theravada it's more individualized. They also say in Mahayana that you don't have to be a monk or a nun. And then you have these bodhisattvas, which basically these are people that are practicing the religion. They haven't become enlightened yet, but they can help others. This is kind of linking, this ideal links with this right here. And then lastly, the third form of Buddhism it's Tibetan Buddhism. It's really basically just the same thing as Mahayana Buddhism, where they share many of the same teachings, but they do believe that special techniques can be used to harness spiritual energy, such as achieving nirvana in a single lifetime. which is a little bit different than what you see in the other forms of Buddhism, because it's viewed that if you look at the principles there, that you might have to live life after life after life to actually achieve nirvana, whether it's you living as a person or an animal or something else in their reincarnation. All right, next we have the Grand Canal and labor. So we're going to be getting into our technological innovations here, which were a big part of Song China. So the Grand Canal was actually completed during the time of the Sui Dynasty, connecting the Huanghe and Xianjiang rivers, as you can see there on the map. And this is important because it created a trade network between north and south. And at the time it was created, you had your land routes as well as the rivers running east-west. So there's no real big way to get north-south, so the Grand Canal allows that to happen. It was a huge, huge project. Thousands died. There's over 1 million people were used to create it. But this was also being built at the same time that the Great Wall was being built, or at least added upon. Now, eventually what ends up happening is the peasants actually rise up against the Sui emperor and lead to that. That actually leads to the downfall of that dynasty and kind of brings in a new age. But the Grand Canal is very important for transport and trade within the Song Dynasty, really within China from the time it was created, moving even to this day. All right, now further reasons for why there's prosperity going on in China during this time is you see the population of China nearly double over these centuries leading up to this time of the Song Dynasty and during their rule, to where they go over 100 million people. And so much so you actually have several cities within China that are actually over 1 million people in itself. And at this time, that's amazing. I mean, today we think of it's not that big of a deal because there's bunches of cities that have over 1 million people. But at this time, that's huge. Now, let's get into some inventions here. Movable type was a very important invention that was developed during this time period under the Song Dynasty, which made it easier for people to print. There's the big question why there. I mean, I'm sure you guys can understand why that's an important invention in itself. You can see the movable type here, these little blocks where you just put ink on them and stamp them on paper. You have gunpowder, which is an obvious one in terms of why that's influential in terms of not only Song China, but history, using fireworks or military weapons or whatever for construction purposes. Whatever you can think of there, very important invention. And then some other things that were inventions during this time. You have porcelain, which is going to become a huge trade commodity. Paper money, which is important because of you don't have to necessarily carry around gold or silver. It's easier to transport, and you can back it up on a gold standard. You have the development of the magnetic compass. I mean, that's an obvious one too, in terms of navigation and so forth. And then there's other advances in arithmetic and algebra that actually take place in China during the period of the Song Dynasty, such as their use of the negative numbers, which is a huge advancement in mathematics and in particular in building and record keeping and so forth. Just a few more here, guys. Innovation. Let's further kind of keep talking about the extension and inventions and prosperity within Song China. Agriculturally, you have champa rice. Now, rice is a big thing that you guys need to know. It's illustrated in the key concepts. It's a faster ripening rice. You could actually plant it and get 2 crops or 2 yields a year, which is one of the reasons why the population in Song China grew so much. It's also why they're able to maintain it. And it's one of these connections you can look today. Why does China have such a big population today over many other countries? It's partly because of this beginning way back with this strong agricultural trend. Now, trade and foreign contact. We see imperial armies guarding the Silk Road at the time of the Tang Dynasty and the early years of the Song Dynasty. But as I told you guys earlier at the beginning of this lecture, the Song are going to lose militarily, or struggle militarily. They're going to lose the overland connections to the Silk Road routes. So they're going to, if they want to trade on those routes, they actually have to meet with a middleman, and trade prices go up and all that kind of stuff. So it actually pushes them to an ocean trade. And this is where those advancements in technology, such as in mathematics and and arithmetic, and in particular the compass, allow them to focus more on international trade, and they expand greatly that way, and that's why they're going to become an economic power. And they'll trade with the rest of East Asia, such as Korea and Japan, but they're also going to reach other lands to Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean basin to the west. And this is all going to lead to cultural diffusion, so these traits of Chinese culture are going to imprint themselves in other places in the world. Okay, just as we see any time in history where there's a prosperity economically, we see a kind of a growth in expansion in the arts and in cultural ideals such as poetry or art. And a couple of important poets during this time are Li Bo and Tu Fu during the Tang and Song dynasties, dynastic periods. And you start to see really in the literature, you see a mixture of actual life, just regular everyday life stuff, and the Confucian ideologies of the actual culture itself. Now, Chinese art during this period is mainly going to be black ink. There's not going to be a lot in terms of color, but it does try to emphasize kind of the beauty of the countryside, the beauty of their life, and so forth. Now, Tang, China, they're going to collapse, and there's two real big reasons for why they collapse. One is the size of the bureaucracy. If you guys remember way back towards the start of this lecture, it talked about, well, they favored and paid handsomely for those that were skilled and loyal. Well, China's a big country, the bureaucracy grows as they expand territory and so forth. They need to pay for that. So eventually this leads to high costs and drain on the economy. Now, corruption does get in there, everybody's not perfect, and that leads to and some of the reasons for why it collapses. Another reason why it collapses is, even though I've talked about it as a benefit, they're able to turn turn something as a failure militarily into an economic benefit. With the Song being pushed to the south and losing northern China or Manchuria, that is a huge economic base that they don't get. So even though there's a benefit seaward, think about as you have all this drain on the bureaucracy still going on. You've lost all that initial wealth, all that other wealth to the north that could actually maybe help pay for that, or help for military campaigns or other projects that could keep the empire out of debt and keep it more stable. So ultimately what ends up happening is when the Song Dynasty starts to weaken, it opens the door for somebody that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the unit and in the year. It opens the door for the Mongol invasion of China. All right, now we're just going to transition to three slides here. We're going to look at three groups of people in terms of how they were impacted by that cultural diffusion coming from China itself. So Japan's the first one. They are able to develop their own unique culture with a mixture of things from others, such as Korea and China, the two closest Asiatic nations to them. But they get Buddhism from Korea, which actually came to Korea from China, and they actually mix the Buddhist ideologies with their Shinto rituals. So it's kind of what you see in China, where you see Confucians adapting Buddhism and kind of mixing or living along and using both of those together. You see the same thing here in Japan, although Shintoism is more of a religious system, more so than that of Confucianism. Other things that you see Japan borrow from China are they adopt a writing system that's very similar to the Chinese. Their art is very similar. Really, the only difference is they use more color, whereas Chinese art is more just black ink. Excuse me. But one thing is that where it's different is they do attempt to put together a strong central government, just like the Chinese. They're going to be less successful because there's a feudal system that develops in Japan, and we'll talk about that later in this course. But they also don't adopt Confucianism because of Shintoism that was already there and Buddhism coming in. And they also don't adopt the civil service system, which kind of stunts the growth of that strong central government. But again, that's partly because of the feudal system that exists in Japan. So ultimately what ends up happening is Japan is going to, one of the reasons why they're able to create their own unique culture more so than that of some of the other countries we're going to see, like Japan or Korea and Vietnam, is because when the Tang Dynasty falls and opens the door for the Song Dynasty to begin in the late 9th century, Japan actually, for a period of time, closes their doors. They cut ties with China and the outside world, and they're able to basically take things that they've learned and mixed from other cultures and develop off of them, and then but they're isolated, so they kind of make them fit their own society, and that allows them to develop and become a little bit more unique. All right, excuse me. Now the Dai Viet, they're located in Southeast Asia, just to the southern coast, on the southern part of China. You can see there on the map, this is China right here. And here's Dai Viet was located in what we have called northern Vietnam today. So what ends up happening is kind of the same thing with where the Japanese kind of closed their doors when the Tang Dynasty falls or weakens. The Dai Viet do the same thing. They actually were a client state of China previously. They break away from the Tang Dynasty and establish their own independent empire, the Dai Viet Empire. And their culture, because of they existed within the Chinese realm and because of where they're located, even as an independent nation or state, they are a real big mixture of Chinese and Vietnamese culture. They have their own ideals, and particularly within the Dai Viet, women actually have more freedom and more movement up the social ladder than women do in China. But they do have a very similar government style, such as centralized government and a merit-based system. But Confucianism is not something that they actually hold on to as much. It's very limited within this country, but they do adopt Buddhism, and Buddhism takes a strong religious hold in this empire. Now, what happens with the Dai Viet under the Li Dynasty, which is the Li was a ruling family? They actually moved their capital to Hanoi, which is an important power base even to this day. And really, the Dai Viet, they just focus themselves on trade, both maritime and overland trade. But they're going to hunker down on two main principles because of geography: strong centralized rule, and then agriculture. Because Vietnam is a very highly mountainous area, and it's difficult for expansion outside of this realm. All right, last one here is Korea. Now, Korea, because of where it's located on a peninsula to the on the northern part of off the northern part of China, and in between Japan, which is Japan's just off the coast, they're going to actually be a combination of both of those areas, and they're also going to proliferate some of their ideals out to both groups as well. Just like we saw that Buddhism actually comes to Japan through Korea or from Korea. Now, at various points in history over the centuries before the Song period, Korea's been under control by China, and they've established independence in various client successor, satellite states at various periods of time. But ultimately, they adapt the traditions that are brought to them or diffused to them from China and Japan to develop their own culture. Now, they're not going to be as independent or unique as what you see with what happens in Japan, just because of the nature of geography. They're directly linked by a land connection, but they will have their own unique culture as well. In particular, their writing, although very similar to that of the Chinese, takes its own hold and kind of adapts to what the people are used to using. You see a highly artistic culture that develops during this period, or at least the rule of the Silla Empire or the Kingdom of Silla in Korea. But ultimately, you're going to see them kind of push back and forth over freedom, client state status, or being under complete control of that of the Chinese. But they do have a centralized government. There's Confucian principles. They're Buddhist, and they use a civil service system. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. This is 1.1 developments in East Asia. I'll see you guys in the next one.